The GameCube is a console that I have a long and storied history with. It wasn't my first video game console, in fact it wasn't even my second video game console, but it was the one that actually got me into the idea of retro gaming. I believe it was in May of 2013 when I was down visiting my grandparents, and my dad and I went to a local thrift store. In there I found this GameCube, with everything except for the audio-video cables. The lady there didn't know whether or not it actually worked, so she gave it to me for just $2. Thankfully it did work, and ever since then I've acquired a pretty decent selection of games, and that's what I'm here to show you today. Starting off with the oldest title, we have Luigi's Mansion, the original. Now, I have played the other two games in the series, but even still this one is my favorite, and that's mainly because of the atmosphere. Next up, we have the original Pikmin. I've got to be honest, I was never really able to get into this one growing up. I just didn't quite understand what I was supposed to do. Maybe I'll actually have to come back to it one of these days. Next, we have Super Smash Bros. Melee. For those of you that have been longtime viewers of my channel, you'll know that this actually isn't the first copy of this game that I've owned. In fact, for a while I actually had two copies of Melee, but I ended up trading one of them in. This copy was given to me by one of my cousins, and it has everything including the original Nintendo Power inserts. In fact, all three of these games were actually given to me by the same cousin, as well as a few others, but those were sports titles that I traded in at some point or another. All three of these games are complete, including their original Nintendo Power inserts, and they're all in really nice shape too. Next we have Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. This, along with Sonic Advance, was one of the first two Sega games released on a Nintendo system, which I can imagine must have been pretty surreal at the time. Next up we have Super Mario Sunshine. This is not the first copy of this game that I have owned. I did have another copy prior to this, but because of how scratched the disc was, it couldn't get past the Nintendo logo, so unfortunately that copy just didn't work. I was able to trade it in, and with the store credit that I got, I was able to buy my NES. You know, back when that console you could still get for $40 or $50. I did eventually get another copy of Super Mario Sunshine, this one right here, and thankfully it works. And it's definitely one of the more unique Mario games, that's for sure. Next we have what might just be the most obscure title in my collection, Evolution Worlds. This is actually a port of two Dreamcast games, Evolution World of Sacred Device and its sequel, Far Off Promise. They're both roguelike role-playing games, and they were released for the Dreamcast, I believe, in 1999 and 2000, respectively. They were made by a company known as Sting and published by Ubisoft, and this combines those two games onto one disc. Next up we have Star Fox Adventures. If you couldn't tell, this cover here is printed out, and that's actually because when I got this game it was disc only. This and another game were given to me by a different cousin, who unfortunately had lost the cases at some point and had these in one of those DVD book things that you put a whole bunch of discs into. Thankfully I did eventually find a proper GameCube case to put this disc into, and the other one is a bit of a different story, which I will eventually get to. Next up we have Sonic Mega Collection. This was actually my introduction to the original Sonic games for the Sega Genesis. As you can see here, it has Sonic 1 through 3, Sonic and Knuckles, 3D Blast, Spinball, and Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. Believe it or not, there's actually even more games on this disc that you can unlock after completing certain objectives. But this was still a pretty cool introduction to some classic Genesis games long before I got my Sega Genesis. Next up we have The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. One thing that's strange about this particular copy is that it says Player's Choice here, but unlike all of my other Player's Choice games, the spine is still black as opposed to yellow, just something that you don't normally see with a lot of GameCube games. Next up is Skies of Arcadia Legends. Much like Evolution Worlds and Sonic Adventure 2, this is a port of a Dreamcast game, instead just being Skies of Arcadia. As you can tell, this is also a printed out cover, and that's because this too was a disc-only game. I actually got it for Christmas last year. It didn't sell very well, and because of that, it's a fairly expensive game, but it's definitely worth playing, and hopefully it'll be ported to modern consoles at some point in the future. This next one isn't actually a game, but instead a startup disc for the Game Boy Player. Essentially, it's an attachment for your GameCube that allows you to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. Unfortunately, these are very hard to find and pretty expensive too. In fact, they actually cost a lot more than the actual attachment itself. But if you do get your hands on one of these, it's a pretty neat way to play your Game Boy Advance games on the TV. Next up, we have Soul Calibur 2. This is actually a multi-platform game that was also released for the PS2 and the Xbox. What's interesting about the console versions of this game is that they all have one exclusive guest character. In the case of the GameCube version, Link from The Legend of Zelda is that guest character, and that was at least part of the reason why I got this game. It's fun, but I still think that Super Smash Bros. Is the superior GameCube fighting game. Next up, we have Wario World. This holds the distinction for being Wario's first and, to this day, only 3D platformer. It was developed by Treasure, the same guys that are probably best known for developing Gunstar Heroes for the Sega Genesis. Next up is Kirby Air Ride. This is actually a racing game, and definitely one of the more unique ones that you'll play if you ever get the chance to play it, that is. Next up, we have Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. I found this one at the Hamilton Antique Mall, because it was one of the few things that was open during Canada Day. Next, we have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. This one is distinct in that it was the only game Square Enix made for the Nintendo GameCube. All of the other games that they were making at the time were either for the Game Boy Advance or the PlayStation 2. Next up, we have Tales of Symphonia. This was actually my introduction to the Tales series, and it's one of my top 3 GameCube games. It was also the first multi-disc game that I got for the GameCube. Next up, we have the very game that made me want a GameCube in the first place, Mario Kart Double Dash. This was one of the 2 first games I got for the system, the other you'll see in a second. And it's definitely my favorite Mario Kart game, even after all these years. It's also the most unique one, mainly because of the 2 racer mechanic. You should definitely try this one out. Next up, we have Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings, and the Lost Ocean. This is a card-based RPG, and much like Tales of Symphonia, it spans across 2 discs. Next up, we have Sonic Heroes. This one was also released on the PS2 and the Xbox, but from what I hear, this version of the game is the best one, and the PS2 version should be avoided. Next up is Custom Robo, otherwise known as Custom Robo Battle Revolution. This is the 4th game in the Custom Robo series, but it was only the first one to be released outside Japan. Next up, we have Mega Man Anniversary Collection. This includes the first 8 Mega Man games all on one disc. In my Wii video, I had mentioned getting a copy of Wario Land Shake It that unfortunately didn't work, and when I brought it back, I was able to get this with my trade credit. And now we have what might possibly be my favorite GameCube game, Paper Mario with a Thousand-Year Door. I was really excited to hear that this one's getting a remake because it definitely deserves it, especially now that this one is fairly expensive. Next up, we have my other first GameCube game, Mario Superstar Baseball. This, along with Mario Kart Double Dash, was one of the first two games I had got for my GameCube, just so that way I could test it out to make sure that it worked, because, like I said, the lady at the thrift store didn't know whether or not it would work, which is why I ended up getting it for such a cheap price. Next up, we have Sonic Gems Collection. This is similar to Sonic Mega Collection, but instead of having the Genesis games, it actually has some more obscure titles, like Sonic CD. Okay, that one's not too obscure, but then it also has Sonic the Fighters and Sonic R, and this is the only way that I'm actually able to play those games because a couple of those are quite pricey. Next up is the 50th anniversary of Namco Museum. This contains a bunch of classic Namco arcade games like Pac-Man, Galaga, and Dig Dug. Next we have Super Mario Strikers, also known in Europe as Mario Smash Football. This is a Mario soccer game and one of the edgier games in the series, so to speak. And lastly, we have The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, the very last first-party GameCube game. This was another game that was given to me by the same cousin who gave me Star Fox Adventures. What's funny though is that when I was at this pawn shop looking for empty GameCube cases, this was one of the empty cases that I was able to get, and that allowed me to complete my copy of Twilight Princess. And that concludes my GameCube collection, with a total of 27 games as well as the Game Boy Player startup disc. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.